Welcome back. I hope everyone had a great break and had an opportunity to have some lunch and a stretch. We're going to start this session with a quick poll as we have with the other sessions. So the poll is going to come up. Please take a minute to answer when those responses come up, and we'll give everyone a few seconds to answer and then take a look at what the responses look like. What do you foresee as the biggest challenge to the use of a PC-CIS? We have choices of organizational barriers, costs to change from current routine practices, don't know anything about PC-CIS or where to locate them, and then other. Okay, so we'll see our responses come up soon. Okay, it's taking a bit of time here. Oh, there we are. So those organizational barriers, some things like a culture of resistance to change, and pretty closely second, costs to move from what's going on now, and then others who need to learn more, and then a smattering of others. So thank you for that. We will talk about some of those as we go through the next session. So next slide, please. Our next session is bringing together research perspectives. And it's my pleasure to introduce the panel to you. So I have with us today, Jennifer Bright. Jennifer is the Chief Engagement and Strategy Officer at the Innovation and Value Initiative. She brings over 2 decades of healthcare policy, issue management, patient advocacy, and executive leadership to her role. She's also the founder and president of Momentum Health Strategies. Formerly, she was the executive director of the Society for Healthcare Epidemiology of America, which represented physician, advanced practice nurse, and researcher members. I also want to introduce George Gondo, who serves as the Associate Director of Research at the National Psoriasis Foundation. In this role, he oversees the foundation's patient-centered research activities, including the patient-powered research platform, the Citizen Scientists, and he serves as the principal investigator for the foundation's chronic disease education and awareness grant that was received from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He has numerous peer-reviewed publications that focus on the perspective and experience of individuals with psoriasis. And then last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Richard Dick Wilkie, Chief Science Officer at ISPOR. He has more than 25 years of experience in the life sciences arena and is specialized in outcomes research in a succession of leadership roles with Pfizer and its legacy companies. At ISPOR, Dr. Wilkie is responsible for designing and implementing strategic initiatives related to scientific research and content priorities that advance the society's mission of promoting health economics and outcomes research excellence to improve decision-making for health globally. So welcome. I just want to start by saying I think that in this discussion about research perspectives, you all probably wear more than just the one hat that you have now from your past lives. And I think that we're going to hear a lot about that as you have this conversation with us this afternoon. So I'm going to begin with from your perspective as someone who is a research stakeholder. From a variety of research stakeholder perspectives, what do you see as being some of the strengths and advantages of PC-CIS and the PC-CIS blueprint? And Jennifer, you've been involved with us from day one. So why don't I turn to you first so that you can give us your perspective, again, from your current IVI role, but also past roles that you've had in the research arena.
Sure. Thanks, Eleanor. And thanks to everybody. It's good to see such a great turnout for this conversation. Actually, my biggest comment about what the strengths of this initiative are kind of played out in the results of the poll, which, just by the way, I feel like a disenfranchised voter because I didn't get to vote.
Yeah, we don't get to vote.
But, you know my stance on that. But I wasn't surprised that the majority pointed to culture. Class is certainly a thing, and I think that actually feeds into culture. But my comment and the reason why I was so excited to get involved in this project was because I fundamentally believe this is about culture change. This is about balance of power change. Like you said, I have multiple hats. And my entire career has been about how do we elevate patient and family voice in decision making, in policy, in research science, all of those things. So this feels like the culmination of a lot of conversations over 30 years of a career. So this is a balance of power thing. This is about putting the patient perspective and lived experience in the driver's seat de facto, not just talking about it, but creating a dynamic environment in which that can take flight. And I think also the biggest strength of this, despite all the challenges that have already been brought out today, and they do exist, and I can talk a little bit further into the conversation about IVI's own experience with this, but we are shifting culture. We are shifting mindset about why to do this, how to do it, and that, yes, it's complicated, but enough of the talk about complexity already. Let's just get to the business of making it happen. So that, to me, is the biggest strength of this entire initiative.
Great. So George, I'm going to go to you next.
Yeah,
advantages.
Sure. I agree a lot with what Jennifer had to say. I think one of the unique things about this from a cultural perspective in terms of how research is done and how we look at outcomes is it really forces us to take a step back from focusing on outcomes to look at disease and treatment impact. And then we can start to collect a broad set of evidence around those two topics and then figure out what outcomes we have available now, what outcome measures are available now that we might be able to use to assess that impact, and what outcome measures we might need to be able to develop in the future. And we have to think research space is moving pretty fast, and we have this information now. We can think about future research uses or future outcome measures that could be collected and assessing those impacts.
Yeah, thanks, George. I think one of the things that you emphasized in your comments is what something that I mentioned earlier, that we see the core impact set as being the precursor. It kind of helps people see what direction they should go in for the development of measures, for following outcomes, for other kinds of things they might think about, that the impacts are not the outcomes themselves. They lead us to the right ones. So Dick, I'm going to turn to you now and ask you that same question in terms with your researcher hat on. What do you see as some of the strengths and advantages of the patient-centered core impact set and of the blueprint itself in helping us get there?
You're on mute, Dick.
Dick, you're on mute.
So thanks for inviting me, and sorry for the usual faux pas here. From a researcher, somebody who's been involved in this area for a long time, I might have a year or two on you, Jennifer, in outcomes research. Not much more, sounds like. We finally, hopefully, have gotten to a point where all the work that's been done around started with quality of life a long time ago, trying to get things important to the patient on the table, imperfectly back then, but it was a start. Through to all the work with the FDA around, they're finally putting out a patient-reported outcome guidance. More recently, the work on core outcome sets in general, leaving researchers to sort of say, well, yeah, all right, how do I put all these together? And I think this blueprint for the research says, okay, this is a start to pull it all together. The first phase isn't going to do it all, but you got to start with these impacts. What is important to patients? If this blueprint can become standard practice, hopefully it will, then that gives a researcher more certainty about how to proceed when they have to do work with this. And we've gradually, again, over that same time period, gotten increasing involvement from patients in the whole bit of work. This puts them exactly where they need to be, and I think it provides an excellent basis for partnership with researchers in doing the outcomes research. And I'll, as with my economist hat on, it has applications for then evaluation as well. So yeah, I think it's very timely, and I do hope it gets broadly used.
Thanks, thank you. So let's jump now to something that Jennifer started to allude to, and that's the challenges. And we've heard a lot over the previous panels about challenges for the patient advocacy organizations and other patient communities that might take this on. I want to kind of shift the thinking a little bit. What kind of challenge does this bring for researchers in terms of how they might have to start to think differently or operate differently or learn some new skills in terms of working with the patient community or get involved in becoming part of something that a patient advocacy group might do? I mean, I could think of a lot of things where we're going to be asking researchers to do something that they haven't done before and to do things differently. So since we've advocated for patient community leadership, then it's going to be the patient community that will be inviting those researchers to the table to have different roles in helping with PC-CIS development. What kinds of challenges do you see that the researchers might have in adjusting to kind of this new paradigm that Jennifer was talking about? George, I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, sure. I think, obviously this is, as I mentioned, this is a big culture change. And for researchers, this is going to be a bit of a struggle because they're used to being sort of, one, considered the experts because they're pretty knowledgeable. They've spent a lot of time in many years on exploring a particular topic, but also, and if they're operating in the space, a lot of them maybe have started to create core outcome sets, or maybe they have created some core outcome sets already for particular diseases, and they could see this as being a little bit of encroachment on their area, saying, okay, we've already done this work, we know what's important, we know how to measure it, but so that could be a challenge. And then also thinking about when patients are engaged in those existing efforts, the power dynamics change because the researchers and the clinicians leading those efforts are the ones who are identifying and recruiting those patients rather than, for example, I work for a patient advocacy organization. We would recruit those patients and try to make sure that's a representative, a good representative panel of diverse patient voices and not particular patients who may be well educated or well spoken or have a lot of experience in this area. So there's numerous challenges from a researcher's perspective in operating in a PC-CIS, and also just adapting to the idea of creating patient impacts rather than thinking about core impact sets for clinical trials.
Yeah, George, this was something that just like the other groups mentioned, we had an earlier listening session during July with a group of researchers about what they thought some of the challenges would be. And one of the ones that you discussed is one that was raised. It was that there will be individuals, organizations, in some fields that might feel in some way threatened, or that this will interfere with the work that they've been doing. And one of the things that was suggested was that they, of course, need to be invited into this process as early as possible. Can you comment on that, George? I know that was something that you had talked about at an earlier session.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to try to reach out and engage those organizations early, as you suggest, and help them to understand that this work is really complementing the work that they've already done, that they've looked at what exists currently and said, these are the outcomes now that we need to include in clinical trials going forward, so we can have a common set of data and evidence. But this is also then taking a step back and say, okay, well, we've identified what exists currently. Now let's take a step back and see what's the impact of the disease, what needs to be developed, what can we think about in the future. That will be challenging, of course, but depending on the relationships and the existing collaborative frameworks that may exist between organizations or between individuals, it's not an insurmountable challenge, but it is one that needs to be recognized early on.
Jennifer, your comments on the challenges that might be encountered by researchers. I know you've got some experience in this area.
Yeah, so just, and this is something that we're writing up, and I'm happy to share with anybody that's interested after this fact, but we in fact do have a case study. We've been on the journey of doing this de facto for the last 2 years without even knowing we were following the blueprint, which was one of my delights, was to see your blueprint come out and say, oh yeah, we actually did this right, and the point is something I call the tyranny of feasibility, which is, in the research community, there's often a point at which you get bogged down in defining what's feasible versus what we're aiming for. And I am not looking sideways at any researchers for whom that process, right? There's the research question, and we create the structure, and we have the literature review and whatever. But along the way, we've built in some siloed and pretty stiff guardrails into a process. And when I said culture change, I kind of meant we're going to start scrambling up this process and reorienting what we're talking about. And one of the things in our process of working on major depressive disorder was we started by talking to patients. And not just one, but a community, and building out what are we hearing, and then who else needs to be at the table. And then we did partner with a research organization, PAVE at University of Maryland, and they had a structure. They had a established set of value elements that they developed through their own research with patient communities. But what we quickly realized was that we had to scramble their thinking as well, because they came in, they said, well, here's the 42 attributes in these buckets. And the very first conversation that we facilitated between patient communities and other stakeholders and PAVE was, great, but you're missing about 5 things. And those 5 things are actually really important to people living with major depressive disorder. And you could see a bit of the not panic, but just kind of the, oh, moment in the researchers' eyes, saying, well, okay, now we have to go back to the drawing board. And the answer is no, we don't. It's iterative. How do we build that iterative mentality into this very structured process that everybody's comfortable with in the research community? How do we find that happy medium? And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of dialogue, and it takes a lot of positive attitude about yes, we can get to something that's useful for all of us. So I think we talk a lot about getting rid of that feasibility, not saying that we're not talking about feasibility, but not letting that be a limiting factor in the discussion of what's important to patients.
Dick, you deal with a lot of different researchers from different research areas in your work. So you've got economics and patient-reported outcomes and epidemiology and other methods that get used by the researchers that you interact with. How do you see this playing out with them, and what challenges do you see from that perspective, or from various sectors, or from an educational perspective?
So I'll start with something that's not so much a scientific challenge per se, but it's going to be more of a prioritization challenge, I think, because this is going to be real important to drug development, and drug development goes on its timelines. Finding patient organizations to go along with that, how are things going to get going? And some industry researchers who have to do outcomes work are probably going to be frustrated if things aren't moving along the timeline that their drug development timeline is. So getting that right is, I think, it's a transitional challenge. Hopefully this will, over time, it'll all be fine. But I think the short-term challenge is to deal with work, in a drug in phase 1 or phase 2 that thinks it probably needs to do this, but if it's going to be patient group driven, it's not going to be in control of it. And so I think there'll be some things to deal with there.
Some nervousness there.
Yeah, from a scientific perspective, one of these disciplines, I know when I read through it, you explicitly said the metrics are the next phase, but a researcher's mind can't help but get to how are you going to measure these, and how are you going to find things or deal with things that are hard, find things that are you can measure or deal with things that are really kind of hard to measure. And do you want that to affect the process of finding impacts and fleshing them out? Because if in the end you can't measure it, reliably, then that's going to be a problem, and you're going to start running into credibility issues if the measures don't work for, one of the problems in the quality of life field, as you well know, PRO field, has been, do clinicians accept how things are measured, and that these are these concepts are well measured, and that they are strictly attributable to treatment or the disease. And so we try as researchers to do that work as carefully as possible, but it's going to start interacting with what outcomes you're trying to measure. So I think that'll be a challenge too.
Yeah, and I think the intent with the core impact list is to kind of give everyone the same target, so that everyone's shooting for developing measures at the same target. So there may be 5 or 6 things that are on that list, but it's the idea of okay, patients have said these are the 5 or 6 things that are the most important, and we can't measure 3 of them. Therefore, we better put that on a research agenda to figure out how to measure those 3, because it's what patients are telling us are most important. And if we're measuring the others, but we're not measuring these 3 that are most important, then how do we interpret what we do have, knowing it's not what's most important? And how do we interpret and use it? Jennifer, you had a comment about use. I think you were talking about using the PC-CIS for these kinds of things.
Well, so 2 comments. One, on use. I think it is very important to have that conversation on it's a bit of a mapping. So we identify this pool of impacts that are important to patients, families, caregivers within a disease community. We have to start thinking about when is that information useful and for what decision, right? That whole fit for purpose. It doesn't mean that something gets left on the cutting room floor. It's more about identifying the intensity of what it's for, what it informs. And I think Paula just put a comment. There are things that may be useful to outcome measurement, which tie to payment or quality measurement things, but there also may be things that we need to understand more in the context of value, for example. We may need to understand in the context of patient experience, right? Most patient experience is just measured by satisfaction surveys. Anybody who's on this call knows that's insufficient, period. We don't need to discuss that. So use is a big part of it, but I also think my comment is users of this information are not passive actors in this discussion. And I've heard it a couple of times already today. If you're a user of this kind of information, and IVI is a user of, you're not waiting for it to arrive at your doorstep. You have an active role to cultivate, nurture, fund, co-develop. And that is what IVI has been doing for the last 2.5 years, is working with the community of people interested. And what we've discovered is we have an obligation to help patient communities bring forward this kind of information. It benefits all of us. And my second comment is something, Dick, you said, which is, I don't, and this was in one of the discussion questions, where does PC-CIS development stop and where do outcomes measurement begin? And Paula, I think your comment in the chat brings that up. I'll share my view and IVI's view. It's not a silo, it's a cycle. And if we're going to get out of this rut that we're in which everybody's got their siloed data elements and they never talk to each other and we don't share learning, we have to start treating it like a cycle. So for example, in the major depressive disorder, one of the common threads across voice of the patient, dialogue, our internal dialogue, our interviews with individual patients. We're now doing a discrete choice experiment with 300 patients, diverse, all of it. The common theme is the two biggest things that people living with major depressive disorder are concerned about is the impact on their social relationships and their impact on their ability to work. And I can tell you, as a mental health advocate for almost 30 years, we've known that for 30 years. You talk to anybody dealing with a mental health issue, those are the top two things. What are we measuring? We're not measuring that. And to Dick, to your point, I couldn't agree with you more. Difficulty in measurement, but that's the opportunity. The opportunity is to say, why are we not measuring that? That is a fundamental answer to the question of what will make people well, what will make them productive, what will get them to use all the kinds of services, not just medications, to find their recovery. It will answer productivity issues, all of these things, if we can answer those questions. So to me, when we get to that issue of how do we measure it, that's the next challenge. That's the next hill to climb, not the end.
Yeah, the difference between how do we measure it? Well, what's the point in measuring it if we don't know that it's the important thing to measure? If we have to figure out what's the important thing to measure first, then move on to how do we measure it? And we haven't been doing it that way. So George, you're shaking your head. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just gonna to add on to that. I mean, I don't think we can let our current measurement capacity be stayed as a barrier to exploring how diseases impact patients or how treatments impact patients, because measurement and how we are able to measure things is constantly in flux. I mean, we're seeing a big technological revolution with, smartphones and wearables and all kinds of different technologies that we have available that we could track and measure things that we would never have thought fathomable or feasible even 10 years ago. So I think what I would like to see the distinction between the patient-centered core impact set and outcomes really is that this is just trying to define what the impact of a disease and treatments are for patients, and then prioritize those. And then the outcomes is the more what's feasible from now. And to Jennifer's point about the iterative process and the cyclical process, we say this is what we're able to do now. This is what our limitations are currently. Let's try to address those limitations moving forward so we can make sure that we're very mindful of the impact of a disease and treatments on patients, because that's going to change. As new treatments come online, patients will suddenly be more tolerable, or they may have better disease outcomes, but they may be less tolerable to some of the impacts that being on a particular treatment may have on them in terms of safety monitoring, or how the treatment's administered, or payment, or other side effects, or other things like that. So this is always going to be an iterative process. It's not a monolith. It's not set in stone. But I see that the PC-CIS really as being upstream from the outcome section, and really can help inform it, even if there are existing outcomes.
Yeah, and George, I'll add to that too. I think it's also in my experience the kind of thing where when you're, and this is in all of the standards that have been developed for reporting patient-reported outcome measures, you have to begin with that concept elicitation step to figure out what's important to patients, what are they caring about, to figure out what the right outcome measure is. And I personally see the impacts as being an initial foray into that. Once you have figured out what is important, then you can drill down and do some more in-depth concept elicitation to figure out how you get to a measure for those kinds of things, because that's all part of that measurement process. But, if you don't begin with understanding what's important to patients, you're throwing darts at the wall to try to figure out what direction to go in for what is the right outcome measure, what is the right patient-reported outcome measure, or observer, or caregiver, or whatever the right path is. You need an early starting point, and I think we haven't anchored all of that in the earliest starting point, and that's where I see the core impact set stepping in. Dick, I want to turn to you again in this thought of a conversation about how do we reach researchers to get the word out for them to start thinking about something like this, or initiating them with this kind of information about the blueprint, so that when and if they get that phone call from George at the Psoriasis Foundation to please come and join my research team for developing a core impact set, they'll have some idea what George is talking about, or Jen?
Are you looking for an invitation to come present at an ISPOR meeting?
In addition to that.
No, obviously that's one, and I think the usual. So that's where a little bit of the push and pull come in. I think you can put it out there for researchers in the usual areas, the journals and the conferences and that kind of thing, and convene this, discussion groups and webinars and that. If you can start getting the funders to actually mention it explicitly as something that needs to be used, and that's the pull, right? That will get them to take notice. So I think Suze, there's a little wavy thing right behind your head. It took me a second.
That's company.
I think it's that combination that will get people engaged in it, and I think it will. I think it'll and some success. I think that's the other thing. This is still in early stages. It's doing all the right things, but it's got to have some successes to get researchers and maybe even patients to fully embrace it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's an important, and then to talk about those successes.
Yes, I can see that. George, I think one of the things that I wanted to ask you is that you're in a patient group right now, and you've got probably lots of data that you've been collecting over the years. Could you talk a little bit about, from a research perspective, one of the challenges that we've heard is that this is going to be a lot of work, there's going to be a lot of resources, and I think many patient groups see that as a big barrier, and yet they haven't thought about some of the assets that they already have back in their file cabinets that they'd be able to pull out and leverage in something like this. Could you talk a little bit about that, leveraging what you've already got?
Yeah, sure. And it's every patient organization has something that they can start with, whether it's emails that they may be receiving from their constituents in their community. It may be conversations that they've had with individuals in their community at conferences or at different meetings. At the Psoriasis Foundation, National Psoriasis Foundation, we do have a wealth of existing data on patient experience, what they feel is their impact of disease. We've had the patient voice session with FDA a couple of years ago, and we have a navigation center where we're constantly getting questions and comments from individuals with psoriasis and their family members across the country. But I think most patient organizations have something. At least they have some infrastructure in place where they can start to collect that data and refine it better. Usually a patient advocacy organization will have patient representation, especially on their board. So you could start there and start with those individuals. You could start with and just start having some informal conversations. And I think the process can seem daunting, but you can start to collect little pieces of the information. And maybe one of the things I like about the blueprint is the different case studies. So you've got different scale of developing a PC-CIS. So you can see where it can work even for a small organization versus a relatively large organization to see what your end outcome is. And I think smaller organizations sometimes may be representing more rare diseases, and the amount of information that currently is available is very limited in how those diseases and conditions may impact patients and caregivers. So any little bit of information and evidence that can be generated is very helpful as we start the conversation in those particular patient populations on what's most important and what's most impactful for patients' perspective.
Yeah, George, thanks for mentioning those use cases. I think what we want to just let everyone know is that we have about 5 or 6 patient groups that are interested in working with us on use cases. A couple of them have already initiated some of the work, And hopefully we'll be able to announce a full list sometime in the next few months about who's going to be working with us on this, and how we'll be adding those use cases. And they do range from organizations that have a big file cabinet full of information that they've been collecting for a few years, but all the way down to a relatively small rare disease group that wants to get something started because they really believe this could be very beneficial to their patient community and are trying to figure out where to start. And so a lot of things in between. Hopefully we will be able to get that information out very soon when we have some more established I don't want to say commitments, because I think people are very committed, but kind of we're further along in the process. We're still figuring out what that process is going to look like. And I know, Jennifer, your writing yours up is going to be very valuable because you have that experience to look back on, and alignment with the blueprint. We have a question that came in about what will yours be made available, and we have talked about, when Jennifer is finished writing hers up, that we will use that as a use case and put in to our list of use cases so that it will be accessible. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, Jennifer, what you've got in there that you see as alignment, and how you saw some challenges that you overcame, that we've actually incorporated some of those thoughts into some of our thinking?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, yes, it will be publicly available. Everything that IVI does is transparent and in the public domain. We published about our multi-stakeholder engagement process for this entire major depression model. It was published in Pharmacoeconomics, and I'm actually really thrilled to say that ISPOR referenced our approach in its publication of those new health economics reporting standards that said, hey, involve patients, and B, write down what you did and say how it influenced your decision-making. So I was super proud of that, but it's a good example of how we are at IVI are all about publishing as we go, as opposed to waiting till it's perfect or saying, ooh, that didn't turn out the way we want, we're just going to shove it under a rug. So absolutely. I think a key ingredient that everybody has, irrespective of your size, your resources, is intentionality. And if you start from there, all things are possible. I really believe that. There, as George said, there's an abundance of information laying all over the place. Voice of patient reports, comparative effectiveness studies that PCORI funds that are publicly available, focus groups that people within disease communities, maybe not your organization, but maybe you have sister organizations that you could sit down and say, hey, maybe we could collaborate. Maybe 5 of us together get this done better than 1 of us at a time. We, IVI, is unique in this space because as a research organization, we said, we'll fund this. We will underwrite this process. We will bring people together, and we will ask the question, who else? We will explore the how. We will be the repository and the arbiter of all the input and try to find the synthesis and the way forward. That's a unique scenario in the structure, but we're investing in it for the reason that we want to show not just the why, but the how. And so I think that's an important thing. But there's screening data, for example. There's literature searches. There's employer and payer data. And believe me, payers and employers, as Mike Thompson said, are very keen to understand this. Engage them as partners. They might not be able to fund it, but they might be willing to explore their data. And if you ask the question of the data and get some insight, you don't have to see it by patient. You can aggregate it. But the point is, where do you find the signals? And so I think it's just think out of the box. I think the other thing to really focus on is one of the challenges is representativeness. We all know that equity is a huge challenge in this community, in the discussion of value. How do we bring forward subgroup analysis that's authentic, that feels right, that is informed by patients with unique experience? And those patients are not represented in much of the data that we use currently. When we partnered with PAVE and with our multi-stakeholder group, we intentionally said it is very important that we have representativeness in whatever patient sample whether we're doing a 20-person survey or a 300-person discrete choice experiment. We need to make sure there's representativeness. And so we had to use our patient groups, our clinician advocates, our researchers to think out of the box. We can't just go to the stables of professional patient survey and focus group participants. We had to go to FQHC and clinics to find people who couldn't do an online survey. They were doing it manually, or work with the clinician to help put together a person who's on Medicaid, who has major depressive disorder, who can spend an hour online helping us understand their perspectives. That is the level of intention that I'm talking about. And yes, it is time intensive, but the point is, do it, because you learn something new in that process. And the first time is the hardest. And then it's about, what do we learn about how to do this better? And patient organizations in particular are invaluable for helping to connect to the wide network. So not just the folks that are part of their advocacy networks, but how do we find people who are not represented in clinical trials? How do we drive to find people who are lower income, who may be on Medicaid versus privately insured? Those are the kinds of stretching that we have to do as a research community.
Yes, thanks, Tim. Go ahead, Dick.
Add one thing to what I said about getting it known to researchers. Don't forget, and I'm sure you won't, but I'm just going to say it, the pure clinical medical folks, because especially at the drug companies, they still often have final say over what gets in a trial and what part of, when you're talking about, $1 million budget, that's they're going to have. So make sure they know about this as it comes along, not just the outcomes researchers, because we need the outside support. The equity issues bring up some other scientific questions, which I'll hold for the time being. Very important, but
Well, we
part of your question.
We only have 5 minutes left, and so I'm going to just go to each of you for a final comment. So Dick, you might be able to incorporate some of that into your final comment. So George, I'm going to go to you first for just your last comment about the blueprint. And we've talked a lot about strengths and challenges, but just a final few words from a researcher perspective.
From a researcher's perspective, I find it really exciting and really interesting. Outcomes research is hugely important, but it's also because we've starting to get more knowledge around that. We're starting to get some really good outcome measures for what we currently know about patients now. And now it's time to go back to the beginning and start thinking about impacts. And as treatments are improving, especially in psoriasis, now it's time to really loop in the impact of those treatments. And one of the things I love about the blueprint is that it focuses on the impacts of treatment. On patients, on caregivers, and on employers. In the previous panel, I really liked the perspective of the payers and employers, because when you start thinking about different treatments, that patient may have to be, they may have to go to a facility for a couple hours to get a treatment administered, and they may be missing work. So those types of questions start becoming more and more important as we get more effective treatments online. Then we have to think about how they're administered and what are the impacts of those treatments. So very exciting work. And as soon as I saw the blueprint, I just thought, wow, this is something that I've had a lot of conversations about recently, and it was just very, very exciting. So great job.
Thanks, George. Dick, I'm going to jump to you next.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is with the focus being on the patient groups being responsible for this work, my hope is that there is a good supply of research-oriented patient folks to do this work, so that things can proceed the way they need to. I sometimes I know that is building, but I think it needs to be really strengthened so that this can happen the way you want it to happen. Second, you're going to have some interesting challenges with, I think, attribution of impact and to treatment, disease versus other things. These are all down the road. With respect to equity, the same thing, are the same impacts of priority for all different groups at the same level. And and we know it probably isn't. So how do you deal with that and these things? So lots of good work to be done here. So I'm looking forward to seeing it progress.
Yeah. Jennifer.
Gosh, I'm trying to pick one.
You can put all the others in the chat.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think, I agree with everything Dick just said. And
Mm-hmm.
I will say that to me, the biggest proposition here is to recalibrate research agendas, to really drive the resources to where they need to be. Very frankly, we have enough research dollars out there floating around in different pots. I don't believe that we're leveraging them to the questions that matter the most, both from a disease transformation perspective, from a healthcare delivery perspective, and from a value and cost perspective. And having worked in policy and everything else for 30 years, this is the first time I've actually seen more organizations in a position of really power leverage, CMS, Corey, even NIH, starting to dawn on them that maybe we're asking or funding or researching the wrong questions. Maybe we're measuring things that aren't really telling us whether we're getting the biggest bang for our buck. And to me, as an advocate, that's the thing to lean into right now. We've got our shoulder on the door, our foot in the door, whatever phraseology you want to use. All the patient communities on this phone and everybody else need to lean into it. Find your allies, find, researchers and others that think like you do and start to lean in on this, because then we force the door open. And I am not downplaying anything that Dick said about there's a lot of complexity here to unmask, but I really do believe this is our moment collectively. And I also believe this is about how we transform our healthcare system. For people who are dealing with mental health issues, nobody can deny that we have a mental health problem in this country, and we're seeing it in so many different ways. We are never going to change it if we don't start asking the questions differently, driving the dollars towards the things that really matter. And this is the opportunity for you, wherever you sit, to begin to redefine it. So.
And on that note, we're going to close this session with those inspirational words, Jen. Thank you very much. There are some questions that we were not able to answer that are in the chat and in the Q&A, but we'll get to those during the break and try to answer those as best we can. But we also are recording all of them so that we know that we need to address some of those issues as we update the blueprint and revise it for finalization. So thank you very much to the panel. It was a great panel, and I really thank you.